Welcome to Beyond the Bond, a podcast from Bond Brand Loyalty. I'm Morana Bakula, President and CEO of Bond. At Bond, we're deeply passionate about helping businesses grow by strengthening the bonds they share with their customers, partners, and employees. Beyond the Bond is a space where we delve into today's most pressing challenges and trending topics for leaders across industries. Together, we'll explore where customer experience meets brand loyalty, where customer insight meets bold leadership, and where the conversations we have can help shape the future of how brands grow. Today's guest is truly exceptional, someone uniquely positioned to provide critical insights into today's geopolitical events affecting businesses. Our guest brings unmatched strategic insight drawn from decades of leadership in both the public and private sectors. I'm honored to welcome the Honorable Mr. David MacNaughton, Canada's former ambassador to the United States from 2016 to 2019. David has held senior roles across multiple industries, most notably as the President of Palantir Canada. Today, he is a highly sought-after strategy advisor, frequently called upon by major media outlets for his forward-thinking commentary. His deep understanding of complex political and business landscapes makes him uniquely positioned to offer growth-focused perspectives that matter to leaders in every sector. So let's dive in. Ambassador MacNaughton, thank you so much for joining us on our Beyond the Bond podcast. We're obviously thrilled to have you. I personally am thrilled to have you as a guest on this. I am really looking forward to this discussion because obviously you bring a tremendous amount of perspective as a leader in both government and also private businesses. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, I'd love to just ease into the discussion a little bit and have you share, how does one actually become an ambassador? And what are some of those pivotal moments in your career that led you to that position?
Well, there's two ways to become an ambassador in this country. One of them is to be a member of the Canadian Foreign Service, which is probably 95% of our ambassadors. And the other sort of 5% are political appointees. And, that's in Washington and the UK and Paris and a few places like that. So I was very much a political appointee. I had not anticipated at all being an ambassador, but I worked on the Justin Trudeau's campaign in 2015, and out of the blue, he asked me to become Canada's ambassador to the United States. I had not anticipated it was going to happen at all, but all of a sudden, there I was.
Wow.
So it was something, as I say, I hadn't really, it wasn't something I'd sort of looked forward to all my life, but it was a tremendously rewarding experience.
Wow. Well, thank you. It's interesting. Sometimes our jobs find us. Obviously, there is a lot of discussion around the different trade policies that are in place today. And President Donald Trump's election has changed the business playing field as we know it. Given the increasing interconnectedness of global markets, what strategies should organizations and governments employ to enhance cross-border collaboration today?
Well, I think, there's an awful lot of talk about Canada needing to diversify its, its markets beyond the United States. We depend on something like 75% of our exports go to the U.S. And I've heard an awful lot about diversification for a long time,
Yep.
and yet we're as dependent now, if not more so than we ever were. And I think what we really need to do is to think about where that still makes an awful lot of sense. And obviously, the auto sector is one of them where it does make an awful lot of sense. There are others where our supply chains are integrated. There are materials like potash and
Yep.
things like that where the United States relies on them, and it's a good market for us. But there are other places where we could diversify our markets. I mean, we could be exporting our natural gas to Asia to reduce their dependence on coal.
Yep.
There are things, we have more free trade agreements with more countries than any other G7 nation. So there's opportunities, but we're still, regardless, we're going to depend on our relationship with the Americans for a long time to come. And we need to find a way through what is going on at the present moment and try to find solutions that aren't um, Canada simply giving up some of the strengths that we have, but finding a way to deal with, a president who is operating in a way which is quite different from, other presidents in the past. So it's challenging times. There's no question about
I
that.
understand. Let's talk about Canada a little bit. So, I was born in a communist country, and I remember as a young girl, like, dreaming of joining my father here in Canada. And it's a country that always promised opportunity, always promised acceptance. Some of those core things that Canada's promised is still very much in our identity. What do you think is the opportunity for Canada right now in this moment, both domestically but also globally?
Well, I was giving a speech at a university a while ago, and one of the students asked me the same similar kind of question, and I said that I'd been sitting around with a group of Canadians who were all complaining about how bad things were in Canada. And I said, well, you know what? I think you're right. I'm going to try and find another country to live in. And I've got to set some criteria for which country I'd like to live in. So it's going to be I want to have abundant natural resources. I want a highly educated workforce. I want to have a robust agricultural sector. I want to have a huge amount of fresh water. I want to be close to a large market. Does anybody know a country like that? Well, it happens to be Canada. And so I think what we've got to do to start off with is to realize how blessed we are
Yeah.
and to, in at a time where things are really challenging to stop what I think we've been doing for a long time, which is coasting.
Yeah.
We need to seize the opportunity where we have a lot of things that the world needs, and we should just, get our act together and do a lot of things that we've been, you know, kicking the can down the road on for a long time. And I think this is a huge opportunity for Canada.
Let's talk about coasting a little bit. So, I think, when countries or industries or businesses kind of experience long periods of prosperity, think we generally move into a state of coasting, and then we find ourselves in a state where we have to change. What do we need to be thinking about as business leaders, as businesses, as a country to increase velocity, to increase speed, to stop the coasting?
Well, I think, for government, and that this is government at all levels, it is to focus much more on outcomes rather than process. I think we've become sort of very much process dominated where nobody really wants to make a decision because they're afraid they'll get blamed for, if things go badly. We've got to empower people to actually take responsibility and authority and be measured by the outcomes. And I think if you see that at all levels, you'll see actually that the outcomes are going to improve a lot. And rather than having people simply checking boxes and passing it on to the next person, let's set specific outcomes, measure people against the outcomes, and I think you'll find that it'll improve a lot. For business, I think that the reality is we're going through an industrial revolution at the
Sure.
present moment. And the difference between this one and the last one is the last one lasted for many, many years, and this one's happening in a much more compacted time frame. And it really has to do with technology.
Yep.
And I think our businesses need to embrace, the technology that exists and find ways to incorporate it to make their operations much more cost effective, to find ways to actually use that technology to expand their markets internationally. I think it's an exciting time. I mean, what happened is artificial intelligence in many respects was started here in Canada.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, it was a really a huge birth of that. And then you know, people went elsewhere because they found that Canadian companies and Canadian governments weren't embracing the technology as quickly as others were. And so we've got to learn from that, that as difficult as it is to embrace, new technology is the way to make your businesses in your country way more productive.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Industrial Revolution for a moment. So certainly we went from horses to cars. In the 90s, 2000s, we went through a digital revolution. We went from snapping photos and waiting for them to be processed to now being able to upload our photos and the world to see. We have organizations that adapted quickly and survived and are thriving. And then, we have organizations that didn't do that. I think today, on the topic of AI, there are many organizations that are holding and wondering, is this the fad? Is this going to pass? Is this going to, and they're operating from fear, is this going to take away jobs if I embrace it? What's your advice there on this particular topic?
Well, I think those who have embraced it, and I know of many, particularly medium-sized Canadian companies who've embraced the technology and who have done phenomenal things in terms of growing their business and expanding their marketplace to other countries and everything else. There's some really wonderful examples of that. I think the fear part is nowhere do you see that more than our healthcare system.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, last year, government spent over $300 billion on our healthcare system.
Yeah.
And when you talk about AI and healthcare, everybody says, oh, what about data privacy and security? And, wring their hands about that. And, what are the standards going to be? And in the meantime, they keep sending prescriptions by fax machine. They're probably the most,
Unsafe.
and so
Yeah.
so we've got to get around that and realize that yes, you do need to have data privacy and security, but also the phenomenal improvement in outcomes in the healthcare system and the reduction of costs is the potential is just huge, and we're just not embracing it as quickly as we should.
What gets us there? What gets us to embrace it?
I think that in the past, governments have been measured by how much money they're going to put into the system,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yep.
so if you're on a campaign, you're going to say, "I'm going to spend, another $2 billion on our healthcare." Well, it's just throwing money at an open pit that just sucks it up and doesn't change. I think what you're starting to see politicians do now is to talk about outcomes. They're saying,
Yep.
we pledge that by such and such a date, you'll all have a family doctor or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
We'll
the
reduce
promise
wait
is.
times. We'll have that. Yeah.
What that's going to force that's going to force people to actually measure them by whether they deliver on that.
Right.
And they can't deliver on it unless there's a fundamental change in the system.
Yep.
And so I'm holding out some hope. But boy, it's been slow. It really has been slow to come, and it's really unfortunate because I was talking to a doctor a while ago who was in charge of a large hospital's emergency room, and he was saying they spend like 25% of the scans that they have to do, the tests that they have to do, are totally unnecessary if you had a health card with a chip where you could actually
Pass it.
see because you know what the blood type was, what the history was, what they're allergic to, everything else. What they have to do right now is they have to do all of those tests. And what that does is it takes away from the time that people who really need the tests should be having. So we'll hopefully we get there, and we get there sooner rather than later.
So you and I, on different occasions, have had discussions about finding opportunity, even when it seems a bit bleak. You've commented on AI in particular. What are other things that Canada or the world should be excited about? What should we be feeling excited about? Where's the optimism?
Well, I hear people talking about the problem with fossil fuels and climate change. And, there's no question that we face an existential problem with
Yeah.
or a threat with climate change. Having said that, a large portion of the world is still burning coal.
Yeah.
And I remember it wasn't all that long ago that we had a coal plant at Lakeview
Yep.
just outside of Toronto.
Yep.
And the emissions from that caused huge problems with, people's lungs,
Yeah.
with,
Health.
all sorts of health problems. And we had, multiple smog days in Toronto. And we replaced that coal burning facility with a natural gas facility. And you don't have that anymore.
Yeah.
And so rather than being completely sort of leave it in the ground ideological, we should be thinking about where is it that we can actually use some of our resources to actually diminish really bad emissions.
Yep.
And that exists in Asia, where we've got ports on the West Coast,
Yep.
which we could actually export our natural gas. So there's lots of things like that. And we have New Brunswick banned fracking, which is, a way of getting natural gas out of the ground because of the alleged environmental problems. And what they do is they import natural gas from Pennsylvania. How do they get it out of the ground?
Right.
Fracking. So you
Yeah.
kind of think those kinds of things are, we just need to be sensible about it and
Yeah.
practical about it and pragmatic about it. And it doesn't mean you have to lose your environmental bona fides. It's
Yeah.
just, it's a really complicated issue, and let's deal with it in multiple ways, which isn't just by saying, well, just leave it in the ground. That
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. The topic of let's be sensible. So, logic, data, fact, reason. These are the things that have progressed us. In a business environment, leaders right now often feel like all data is gone, right? We're just having to react to the latest hit from a market standpoint or the latest piece of news. And that's creating uncertainty with consumers, but it's also creating uncertainty with our employees, right? There's a lot of fear and hesitation. What are the techniques, tools that you've employed in times like that as a leader to create some stability, to create forward moving momentum?
Well, I think a lot of it is, you know, to be confident, because if you're confident and if you're optimistic, then I think a lot of people who are employees will look at that and say, oh, I should do that too. The other thing is don't talk all the time. Also listen. Listening
Mhm.
is a remarkable thing. Um, but we're living through a difficult time because I remember when the internet first came about and there was the Arab Spring phenomena,
Yeah,
and everybody said, "Oh, this is going to be wonderful. It's going to democratize the world." And yet, what we found is the bad guys have learned how to use
that's
it
right.
a lot better than the good guys,
Yeah,
and so it's led to misinformation, to polarization, rather than trying to create some sort of a consensus. I think we see some signs of that in this country, but on the other hand, I still think that Canadians, by and large, are sensible, moderate, who do rely on facts, and that can be a real strength in a world where you know people are being torn apart by this kind of division. So it's and in terms of the when I was at the embassy in Washington, we had interns who used to work every semester. And at the end, there were about a dozen of them every time. And at the end of it, I used to sit down with them. And one of the most frequent questions they had was, do you have any career advice? And my advice then was the same as it would be now. And that is, don't try to plan your work life for your whole
your
career,
career. Yeah,
because you'll miss opportunities that are going to come along. Because I never planned anything that has happened. And I just every once in a while something came along and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Why don't I do that? And then why don't I do something else? And it's always been tremendously rewarding. And particularly in today's world, that's even more so
yeah,
because sort of thinking, I've got this job. I want to keep this job. I'm going to be doing this job for the rest of my life. Um, not necessarily, and yet there may be something more interesting, more exciting for you to do if you keep your mind open. The most important thing to do is to develop, you know, the skills of learning and questioning and not just accepting the stuff that you see on social media, but asking questions every time.
I love that you say that. I studied philosophy, and I feel like everybody should take a philosophy course because it teaches you to continue
Critical
to
thinking.
question, yeah, and not just accept the answer as is. Let's talk a little bit about how you build that muscle. So, in your experience, and I'm sure particularly when you were an ambassador, there were things that hit you that you completely didn't plan or expect. The ability to navigate when the unexpected happens. How do you build that muscle as a leader?
Well, again, I think relationships help. You know, developing relationships that people trust you, then that works. But the other thing is, and I said earlier, the ability to listen. If you can surround yourself with or tap into people who have a different perspective, a different experience than you do, and listen to what they say and absorb it, then you'll be better off. You don't have all the answers. You can't have all the answers. And learning to tap into people who've got different experience, different background is really, really useful. I mean, we used to. I learned a lot when I was in Washington from people who had spent their lives doing totally different things, who were but who had a perspective that I didn't have, and that's really important. And in my consulting business, I remember we used to, I'd get half a dozen of the, some of the key people. We'd sit around, we'd think about how we should deal with a client's problem. And what I found was at the end of the discussion, we came up with a better solution
Sir, yeah,
than any one of us would have come up with ourselves. That
yep,
the team together
yep,
was much stronger than the sum of the parts.
yeah.
And I think that's something you got to recognize.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful, and I think in our desire to move quickly, we don't choose the right moments to actually pause and have a conversation and hear different
Right.
perspectives. Is there an interesting time where you thought you knew something, like, unequivocally, and then your mind was changed?
Well, too many times to mention, but I do. Yeah, I mean, early on, I presented my credentials to President Obama, um, and there was a very warm relationship between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama, and a lot of people were talking about the bromance and how wonderful it was, and how things Canada and the U.S. were going to get along better than ever.
Life was gonna be so easy for you.
Yeah, I thought I was, I'm going to be the best ambassador ever. Um, and so I decided I would tackle the softwood lumber issue because it was a problem between Canada and the United States. And so met with the U.S. Trade Representative. And after a few meetings, he finally said to me, we're not going to do anything about that. And I said, what do you mean? I mean, the president and the prime minister get along so famously. And he said, well, the president's in legacy mode, and the one thing he wants to leave behind is to have the United States join the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we need some key people in the Senate on side, and a number of them that we need on side do not want us to do a deal with Canada on softwood lumber.
Yep.
So it's not going to happen. And it was kind of a reality moment for me, which is, you kind of you assume that the headline is all you're going to be dealing with, but there's a whole lot of print underneath the headline that you got to worry about.
Yeah.
It was a good learning lesson for me.
That's Thank you for sharing that. Uh, you do a ton of these interviews. Is there a question that you either love answering or a question that you wish somebody would ask you but never does?
The question that I really don't like answering very much is, could you comment on what the difference between President Trump 1 and President Trump 2 is?
We don't need to go
Don't
No,
need to
we don't need
go
to go
into that. It's kind of uh,
there.
because there are there are differences. The one that I have been asked that I feel fairly strongly about, and that is people say, well, you know, why don't we just reopen the CUSMA USMCA negotiations right now? Why wait till 2026? And, my answer to that is, well, actually, it isn't a renegotiation in 2026. It's a review. It was never intended to be a renegotiation. The agreement will last for another 10 years. If we can't agree to extend the agreement,
Yep.
then we have to sit down every year for the next. But it's not a renegotiation, and there's no point in having that discussion right now, given the turmoil that's going on and the anti-trade bias in the United States, and the fact that what the president's using is not the USMCA to impose the tariffs. He's using, two things that have nothing to do with that,
Right.
Section 232 and IEPA and all this kind of stuff. So what we need to do is to address that, which is our defense and security relationship with the United States. And we will get around to talking about trade and doing a review as to whether or not everybody is living up to what they committed to in 2018. We'll do that in 2026. And there's just a lot of people rushing to try to, say, let's sit down and negotiate over what? We've got a trade agreement that is fine, but that's not what is happening right now. When, president's using defense and security to impose tariffs. We need to address that, and hopefully, if we do, that'll remove the tariffs.
Yeah. So focus on the problem at hand and
Yeah, let's
yeah.
focus. Let's focus on that. And in truth, Canada does need to step up and do more on the defense side. I mean, we know that we should have been doing more of it. We can do more, and let's have a real discussion about that.
Great. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Obviously, you've shared a lot of compelling insights. Before we close, maybe not career advice, but some of your sage, wise advice for business leaders today. What advice would you give them as they navigate both their cultures for their people, but also their businesses for their consumers?
Well, I think you know what is really important right now in when with so much turmoil going on is not to panic. And I know that's really hard when you've got shareholders, when you've got customers, when you've got, it's got to be extraordinarily difficult. But I think if we focus in on making sure that our enterprises are, the best that they can be in terms of the technology that we're using, in terms of identifying perhaps some markets we haven't,
Yep.
who are working with government to find solutions to what they're trying to struggle with, and as I say, projecting an air of confidence and determination, then I think, things will be fine. I can't promise that they're going to be fine tomorrow or next week,
Yep.
but I don't think this is going to last for a long, long time. And, we've been through, there've been turbulent times in the past.
Yep.
And I think those who have emerged, a lot of companies that had difficulty during turbulent times have emerged
Much
better.
stronger.
And I think
Yep.
that's what you got to think about is
Yep.
not how am I going to preserve what I've got, but how am I going to make my organization better when we
Yep.
come out of that.
Yep.
And I think that'll get your employees enthusiastic too. They'll be saying, "Oh, well, I've got a role to play.
Yeah.
This is important."
And that sense of purpose, I think,
Yeah.
drives us more than we maybe even rationally
Yeah,
consider every day.
totally. It's something that, is when I was in Washington, they do a they they do an audit of all of the large embassies every 10 years.
Yep.
And my last year there, they did an audit of the embassy, and the person who was doing the audit came to me and said, what is it that you're doing? Because people here are really motivated. I've never seen the number of people that say that they would recommend to their family or friends that they work here.
Well,
And I said, well, I'd love to claim all the credit, but I think a part of it is also that just the times we were living through, they had a sense of purpose. They had a sense of accomplishment. They actually felt that they were part of doing something that was important. And I think if you can, hopefully you don't have to go through some of the turmoil we're going right now, but if you can create that among your employees, I think your organization could be way better off. So
That is an incredible way to close. It was just 5 years ago that we were in the middle of a global pandemic. That was terrifying because it was so unknown. This is human beings just figuring out how to work with human beings.
yeah,
And I think that should make all of us feel a little bit better. If we can navigate a global health crisis, sure, we can navigate
yeah.
navigate
I wouldn't
this.
say it's a piece of cake.
No.
But but it's doable.
It's doable.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much, Ambassador MacNaughton, for your time. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, and we always love having the opportunity to engage with you.
Well, thank you. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
That kicks off our first Beyond the Bond podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Bond Brand Loyalty. Bond is the premier customer growth partner to Fortune 1000 brands focused on customer loyalty and engagement. If your business is faced with a customer growth challenge, Bond is the partner to call. Visit us at bondbl.com for more information. If you found today's episode valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to Beyond the Bond on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, keep building meaningful bonds. Thanks again to David MacNaughton for joining us today to share his story and perspective. And thank you all for listening.